Right.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for everybody who's here. We have 39 participants so far, and I think that that's a really good turnout so far. So thank you all so much for taking an hour out of your evening to kind of educate yourself a little bit further about the things that are happening here in Michigan and how the pandemic is affecting our communities. My name is Janet Ibarra, and I am a senior at Michigan State University. I'm double majoring in social relations and policy and political science pre-law with a minor in Chicano studies. And I'm originally from Bangor, Michigan, which is on this side of Michigan. If you're from Michigan, you know that we use the mitten. I was born to two Mexican immigrants from Morelia, Michoacan. And we're also seasonal farm workers. We pick blueberries in the summer, and I'll be joining my parents this weekend to help them with the rest of the season. And I'm also a current participant, program participant for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. And Toyota is actually my sponsor, and they were able to allow me to be a part of the program. And as a part of my internship, I was required to create this community service ambassador project to highlight how our community, and specifically Black, Brown, and immigrant communities, are being disproportionately affected by the current pandemic with coronavirus. And when I was assigned this project, really the first thing that came to mind was how prisons are a form of systematic oppression that also disproportionately incarcerates Black, Brown, and immigrant lives. And clearly we're seeing how prisons are really being hit hard by coronavirus. And I really wanted to use this project as an opportunity to highlight and amplify the work that these organizations and individuals are doing. And I really wanted to use it as an opportunity to also inform college students and educate and raise awareness about how we can get involved. Today, I think we live in a society that really relies on social media platforms and overall technology to organize and campaign. And although I think that that's a really powerful tool, I think we do have to be very careful and mindful on how we use those tools because it's just not enough in what we're seeing today. And I think that it's really important that we really start to listen to the work that these organizations are doing, including No Detention Centers in Michigan, and a lot of these individuals who have given up so much of their time and their lives for these social justice issues. And that's what we're here doing today. And I just want to thank all 46 of you who are here on this call once again. I do want to know as a disclaimer that although this project is assigned to me by CHCI, this project is individually led by me, and my views and my opinions do not reflect at all those of CHCI, as they are a nonprofit organization. So today we're going to start off by kind of getting a little bit of a history lesson. I think that in order to be able to fully be able to comprehend what we are seeing today, we need to understand where this started and where this rooted. And so we'll kind of be giving a little bit of a brief overview on the private prison system in the US, and then narrow it down to Michigan specifically, and then narrow it down to the work that No Detention Centers in Michigan is locally doing. And then we'll talk about how as students and professionals we can get involved. So I'm going to start off by first introducing our speakers who are joining us. First we have Oscar Castellanas. And I'm going to give a little bit of a brief overview of them and their work, and then I'll allow them to further introduce themselves and give a little bit more detail. We have Oscar. Oscar is a community organizer with Action of Greater Lansing. His work in the organization is focused on civil rights for immigrants, and I have personally had the honor to work alongside Oscar for the past 2 years, and he is just an incredible person. So I'll allow you to introduce yourself, Oscar.
Thank you very much, Janet. So I think that she thinks too much of me. I'm Oscar Castañeda, and I've been organizing in Action of Lansing for a couple of years. And I organize around civil rights for immigrants in Action. Action is a faith-based organization. And I organize around civil rights for immigrants because I have a skin in the game. Because I've been in the United States for 27 years for some convoluted reason that we'll talk about some other day. And I have no qualms about speaking of my situation. But after 27 years, I never broke the law. I always follow the regulations. And I still don't have what is called a green card. And I'm still fighting a case. And any of these days, I might be kicked out of this country. after 27 years of respecting every single regulation, because this is a broken immigration system.
Thank
Are
you.
you gonna go with the other persons, or you wanted to speak now?
I can, no, I can introduce the rest of the speakers and then we'll go ahead and start. So next we have Judith Green. Judy is Director of Justice Strategies, an independent nonprofit policy research group based in New York City that focuses on the problem of mass incarceration that span elements of both the criminal legal justice system, from police to prisons, as well as the immigration laws and policies that have caused rapid growth in the number of non-citizens behind bars. Judy, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I was muted. We do this work sort of looking at the whole pie of mass incarceration. And we look at that through a racial justice lens, because as everyone knows, the vast majority of people behind bars in this country are people of color. And in the very late 1990s and through the last 2 decades, one of the fastest growing groups of people behind bars have been non-citizens, immigrants of various status. So we include them in the picture, looking at the role that private prison companies have played in facilitating that increase, and working with groups around the country that are mobilizing to oppose all this.
Thank you so much. We'll definitely hear from you again. So our next speaker that we have is Cynthia Price. Cynthia is a recently furloughed newspaper editor, reporter, writer, and photographer, and a longtime graphic designer. She has spent her whole life giving of time to various efforts, from food systems to water quality at local, state, and national levels. Cynthia, you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Actually, I don't have much to add to that. The only thing that I will add, because of what you said, Janet, is that I do focus a lot of my time on farm workers, migrant farm workers in particular, and I am part of Washtenaw Solidarity with Farm Workers, which actually works a lot with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida. Traditionally, but we are now branching out and working with more local farm workers.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to hear about your presentation later with No Detention Centers. Next, we have J.R. Martin. J.R. lives in Grand Rapids and organizes with No Detention Centers in Michigan, GR Rapid Response to ICE, and other projects for justice and abolition.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Janet. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It's really great to see so many faces. And I think, like Cynthia, I don't have too much to add to that. My name is JR. I use they, them, or he, him pronouns. And I live in Grand Rapids. I'm not originally from Michigan, but I've been in Michigan for about 10 years at this point. And as Janet said, I'm involved in a few projects. One of them has been around for 3 or 4 years at this point, Rapid Response to ICE in Grand Rapids, which is a mutual aid and rapid response project that was formed in the last few years to support, members of immigrant communities in West Michigan, particularly Grand Rapids, who have been who are targeted by ICE violence. And so that's meant working considerably with the local chapter of Movimiento Cosecha, which is the immigrant-led justice movement that has a really active presence in Grand Rapids. And I've been involved with No Detention Centers in Michigan since its founding about 1.5 years ago. And it's been a real honor to work with Oscar and Cynthia and other folks on this call. So thank you again for having us.
Thank you so much. And really, thank you all for the work that you do. I mean, you're all heroes. You don't have a cape on, but you're all heroes. You're doing amazing work. And I know you've dedicated so much time your lives to this work. And I do want to thank you all so much for being here again and for all the work that you're doing. So now we can go ahead and get started with our event. I asked the audience that if you do have the capacity to, out of respect, if you can, please turn your cameras on so our speakers know that they are talking to a person and not really a black screen. But if you don't have the capacity to do so, that's totally okay as well. And I also ask that if you have any questions at the end, if you have any questions, we're gonna go ahead and save that. We're gonna have a Q&A session at the end to answer any questions that you might have so that we can go through our presentation seamlessly. So with that being said, we can go ahead and get started. Our first item on the agenda is with Oscar. Oscar, if you wanna go ahead and take the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Janet. So what I'm gonna try to do is I'm gonna try to create a context of the history of mass incarceration in the United States of America. And of course, this is a subject that takes books and takes semesters of education in universities and takes PhD dissertations. I'm gonna try to put it here in 10 minutes. So many things will be out, and I'm gonna try to be as syntactic as I can in many areas. There is so much to be said about certain things. Let me try to show you a PowerPoint that I prepared, and hopefully it comes okay, and it can aid me in my presentation. And of course, folks, I am more than very well aware of my accent, and I will try to speak clear. And if you don't understand me, ask me. I don't get offended if you say that you didn't understand what I said, because it happens more often than what I wish. Okay, so let's start the show. Okay. I'm gonna start talking. I have to put my little plug, of course, and talk about my organization. This is the one that is allowing me to be here. I am a community organizer, as I said before, in Action of Greater Lansing. It's a faith-based organization in the Lansing area, and we are trying to move into different areas of work. I am focused on the civil rights for immigrants team, but the organization has steps in some other areas. And we are trying to start in environmental justice. We've been working with people with disabilities for a long time. And we can talk about this longer in the future. So I chose to start this conversation with something that I'm calling the Nixon-Bush War on Drugs. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm using this title just to entice you a little bit, to push you a little bit, to make you think about the whole thing. I believe that those were very important points in the history. And allow me to go through the facts, and then you will see how the connection happens. You might be wondering now, we're talking about drugs and Nixon in the 60s. How did that happen? I came here to talk about immigration, but come with me and you will see that it makes sense. So the first question would be, why did we choose this point? And let me say something. I do not advocate for drugs, and I'm not saying that people should be consuming drugs. And I think that there are some serious health issues related with them, but we need to know that many currently illegal drugs, such as marijuana, opium, coca, psychedelics, they have been used for thousands of years for medical and spiritual purposes. So why are some drugs legal and other drugs are illegal today? In the beginning, you might think that there is some science, and the science made the assessment and decided what is risky and what is not risky. But sadly, when you look back, you will find that most of those decisions are made based on who is consuming those drugs. And that becomes a very serious problem. So just to give you history, and I really like this slide because I have a similar slide on how all the immigration laws were made focus on specific human groups. The first ever law that had to do with banning drugs in the United States of America was the anti-opium laws in the 1870s. And those laws were made to punish Chinese immigrants. And it was focused only ones who were consuming opium at that time that were Chinese immigrants. Another big wave of regulations came in the early 1900s and to control the consumption of cocaine. the vast majority of people who was consuming cocaine at that time were black men. So it was focused into black men. Then in the beginning of the 19th century, they started to ban marijuana. Marijuana was coming from Mexico, and it was focused on Mexican immigrants. Let's push it to today. Latino and much more black communities are subject to incredibly disproportionate drug enforcement and sentencing practices. It's totally reflected in the populations that you see in jails. We will talk about this later. So before we move into the conversation, I want to really send a quick question here. And I was planning to prepare a poll, but I didn't. I want to see in the whole screen. I want to take 1 second to see everybody. Could you raise your hand and tell me if you were a teenager in the 60s? Okay, we have 1, 2. Would you raise your hand if you were a teenager in the 70s? 80s? 90s? $2,000s? All right, so we have a very diverse group here. That really makes the conversation more interesting. And I was asking this question because I wanted to see who can remember the 70s and the 60s. And for a full disclaimer, I don't remember the 60s. I was just a baby in the 60s. So Nixon came to be the president of the United States. In the 60s, drugs became to be a symbol of youthful rebellion, social upheaval, and political dissent. At that time, believe it or not, and we are seeing similar things today, the government halted scientific research that was working in finding the medical safety and efficacy of drugs. Yes, the government stopped it. They didn't want to know about the science. Just on these days, Nixon became the president. And in June 1971, President Nixon made a lot of fanfare and noise to declare that he was starting his war on drugs. And he named it as this, his war on drugs. Under that process, he dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies. And he pushed many measures. Number 1, he started with mandatory sentences, something that was never seen before in the field of drug consumption, and the no-knock warrants, meaning that you could break in houses without asking for permission to come, which was a very, very big change and created a lot of constitutional challenges. Now you might say, okay, he was doing it because he really cared about the drugs, because he was really concerned about the health of the American citizens. But oftentimes there are ulterior motives behind things, and in this particular case, there were ulterior motives behind the war on drugs. And if you read about his history, this man, John Ehrlichman, is very well known and has a lot to do with all those problems that they had with the scandals that Nixon had later. But in this particular case, and it's very interesting, he was one of his advisors in the 60s, and in 2016, he had an interview with Harper's Magazine. And talking about the war on drugs, he made this statement. And I want you to please read this statement carefully. He said, speaking of the war on drugs, you want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 at the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Do you understand what I'm saying? We knew that we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. That's one of the main advisors of the President of the United States in 1971. Do you think that there was science behind it? Do you think that there was a good intention about the American people? So That was Nixon starting this big noise. Then the next guys, we had the Reagan days, and so many people in the United States worships Reagan and his administration. So many people worships his trickle-down politics, economics, I'm sorry. I am a Central America. I grew up in Guatemala, and I grew up, my country, as well as Salvador and Honduras and Nicaragua, were deeply affected, and there were hundreds of thousands of people killed by wars that the Reagan administration was financing. And this is blood that is in many people, and is blood that was shed in that land. And a lot of young people, especially, and that's why I was asking you your age, you might not even hear about those wars, but it's true. But anyways, coming back to this subject, Reagan skyrocketed the rates of incarceration. It was totally unprecedented, all those changes that he made. And then something even more interesting, the one who came after him was George Bush, his vice president. In his first day that he addressed the country as a president, he sat down in the Oval Office and he showed this bag of drug. And he said, let me find the statement. He said, in his first night, he said, look at this bag. This is crack cocaine. We seized it a few days ago in a park just across the street from the White House. It looks like innocent candy, but it's turning our cities into battle zones. Battle zones. He's talking about war, death, all those things. Years later, it was found that this bag was fake. It was found that they coerced a young black man to come, a secret agent from the president went to a faraway location. He coerced a young man to come to Washington, D.C. and sell a bag of crack so they could capture him and have the bag, and so he could use it as evidence in this presentation. I know you might not believe what I'm saying. You might not believe me. Take a note of this situation and Google it after this presentation. You will see that I'm not lying. It's proof there have been so many articles written about it. This is the way people was pushing this war in drugs and pushing for mass incarceration. So what is the effect of this mass incarceration? Let's look at history of mass incarceration now. In the 1920s, we had, if you see this graph, you might get the sense that we have probably 100,000 people incarcerated. Then when you look at the graph, 1981 is when Ronald Reagan became the president. Look how a step it goes all of a sudden. Then it comes George Bush, 1991. The curve keeps going up, up, up. By the 2000s, we had almost 2.5 million people in jail for the 100,000 in the 1920s. And then you might be saying, now you might be thinking, well, the population grew, the United States is a bigger place now. And there is some truth to it. How do we stack when we compare our inmate population with other countries? This graph is showing us how many inmates are in each country for each 100,000 inhabitants of the country. United States had 707. Our next competitor is the Russian Federation. It was the Russian Federation, which doesn't exist anymore. They had 474. It's almost half of what the United States have. And if you look at this graph, countries that we like to compare with when it comes to development parameters, with economical parameters, they are way behind us. Look at France. France has 100. We have 700. Look at Germany. Germany has 77. It's a tenth, almost a tenth of what the United States. Our inmate population is huge. It's big. And guess what? We still haven't won the war in drugs. Incarcerating people didn't make it. It just didn't cut it. So this whole process of putting people in jail because they were consuming drugs, because we wanted to stop the drug consumption, created this problem of having way too many people to put in jail and not having places to have them. And then, because the American ingenuity, we came with this idea of having private jails, giving the opportunity to have people making money building jails. And you know, everybody, they told you in high school that private companies will do things always better than the government. And now we have a $5 billion a year industry. They started at the state level in 1984. It was operated by a company that had a different name in 1984. Today it's known as Core Civic. It changed names a couple of times. Judy is going to talk about it with more detail later. 1984 was at the height of the war on drugs, and the prison population was growing so much, and the facilities couldn't keep up with them. That another really interesting fact, in Tennessee, one judge ordered his courthouse to stop admitting inmates because the conditions of overcrowding in Tennessee were unbelievable in 1984. This is when companies say, don't worry, we can do it better. We will do better. We have technology. We will have a smaller staff. We will save money to the public. And where we are now today. Private prisons today are housing about 9% of the US prisoners nationwide, and 19% of all the federal prisoners. And you might say, well, 19% is not that much. This is 1/5. Those numbers have decreased. And again, I will not talk about the reasons for those numbers decreasing. Judy Green will address this in a few minutes. But they were higher at the end of the last century. By 2000 and late 1990s, numbers were higher and then start to decrease. We will talk about it. But what I really want to bring to now is today, about 75% of all immigrants detained by ICE are in private prisons. 75%. Out of 4, 3 are in private detention centers or private jails. That is the problem that we want to address today and we want to talk about today. But you can see how people is in private detention centers and private jails today because there was this huge structure of big companies making a lot of money out of having people incarcerated, because we created that need of having needing places to incarcerate people because we thought at that point that was the solution of a problem that might not even exist. Maybe all that people that was getting addicted to drugs, maybe they needed counseling, maybe they needed medication, maybe they needed family support, and many more other things. So today there are 2 big companies that dominate that market. One is Core Civic, yes, the same one that started in Tennessee in 1984, and Geo Group. Geo Group, which takes 30% of the market and is the second largest, is one of the companies that we are fighting here in Michigan today. And Cynthia and JR, they will talk in more detail about this company. Geo Group donated $100,000 to a super PAC that was supposed to supporting Donald Trump. And a subsidiary of Geo Group donated $125,000 to his campaign. There are so many articles that speak of how the Geo Group leadership and all the high executives were heavily encouraged to donate from their own money to his campaign. And if this is not enough money, Geo Group and Core Civic together gave $250,000 only to Donald Trump's inauguration committee. Maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe I am naive and I'm still giving them a chance, but maybe it's a coincidence that now this administration is really focused in getting immigrants and putting them in detention and having them in jail before deporting them. So the question is, how did these companies went from incarcerating people who was suffering drug addictions to the immigration detention business and the immigrant incarceration business? And to talk about this transition that they had, myself, I will have a transition. I will give the word to Judy Green, who will talk about this process.
Thank you, Oscar. That you really put the right frame on what I'm going to talk about. Don't know whether anybody who is on this webinar today owns any private prison stock. or I hope not, or whether any of you watch this industry closely. I saw a news article just last week, I think, that Geo's stock price had fallen, and the reason was that Core Civic, which used to be called CCA, had announced that they weren't going to be able to pay dividends to their stockholders, and the industry seems like it is in a fair amount of trouble these days. Partly, I think, due to all the wonderful organizing that's been done for years by students and activists to get banks and other investors to divest from these companies. And in the last year or so, most of the major banks located in this country have announced that they're not going to lend the industry any more money. And as a result, the banks that will lend to them are charging them an arm and a leg in interest. So the situation is not great for the industry. This is the second time since I began watching, all the way back in 1984 when CCA was born, watching this industry grow, that the industry has run into really hard times financially. And the irony is that the last time was around the year 2000, and the reason had been the industry was built on a state prison population boom. That was their market. And as Oscar was saying, when the drug war really heated up and we had more and more prisoners at the state level, they were really high flying. CCA was one of the best performing stocks in the mid 90s on the US Stock Exchange. However, in the late 90s, the prison boom began to cool off a little. And at the same time, stories started surfacing in the national media about all the operating problems these companies were having with escapes, with uprisings in their prisons, with people dying from poor medical care, etc. And as the pressure was reduced on state governments to contract with these people, they went into a market slump. And by the year 2000, CCA was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. And Geo, which was called Wackenhut back in those days, wasn't doing very much better. However, along came a wonderful miracle from their point of view, a huge disaster for the rest of us, which was called 9/11. And the terrible events on September 11th, 9/11, hit the industry like another boom was on its way. And as a matter of fact, in October 2001, I was listening in on teleconference that these companies have quarterly with their stock investors. And Steve Logan, who was then the CEO of a small company called Cornell Corrections, now part of Geo, they bought it up before it could become a serious competitor. Steve Logan was just crowing. He was just so happy because he said that, the government's really going to crack down and focus on all of these people who are illegal, all these people from Middle Eastern descent, he specified. And he said more people are going to get caught, and the federal business is going to be the best business for us. Now, he was right about the federal business becoming the best interest. He was wrong that those private prison beds and private detention beds would be filled up with people of Middle Eastern descent, because the irony was, once we declared a war on terror in response to the attacks on this country from the Middle East, we filled those beds with Latinx people from Central America and Mexico, almost entirely. I'll show you some stats a little while later. So just one of the ironies that the drug war that Oscar described so well became the immigrant war, the war on immigrants. And it really, it was right out of the drug war playbook. Things really got going the second Bush term in 2005, 2006. when Michael Chertoff took over the Department of Homeland Security, and he really bared down on waging this war. He said that they were going to do away with what they called catch and release. In other words, people coming across the border were all going to be detained. He ramped up the interior enforcement, ICE efforts beyond the border. That year, he masterminded a 6-state dragnet of meatpacking plants that were operated by Swift and Company. They deployed more than 1,000 federal enforcement officers and rounded up more than 1,200 immigrant workers in those plants. So this gave rise, obviously, to a brand new market for detention beds, principally. In 2001, there were a few more than 20,000 people in detention in this country. That was up markedly from about 68,000 back in 1994, when we really began slowly to increase our reliance on detention after NAFTA was enacted. So by 2008, when the Obama administration took over, there were more than 31,000 people in detention beds. By the end of the Obama administration, it was 34,000. But boy, the Trump administration has come on like gangbusters, as you well know. So that by 2019, last year, the average daily population was more than 49,000. And last September, the population hit 53,000 people. This is a huge increase in the market for detention beds. And as Oscar said, 75% of the people in ICE detention are in private prison beds. So where is the other 25%? Well, some of you know that there are jails in Michigan as well as across the country that house most of the rest of that. ICE doesn't really run much in the way of detention facilities at all. They rely on contracts with local jailers. And there are 140 jails across the country, the last data I could find, that are holding people for ICE in detention under what they call an intergovernmental service agreement with ICE, between ICE and the jail, or they piggyback on contracts that the U.S. Marshal Service holds with those jails. So that's where the other 25% came from. And by the end of last year, this detention industry was a more than $3 billion industry. So it's not just private prison companies making money off this stuff. It's also your local counties that are raking in money from the federal government. The other thing that Michael Chertoff did was that he took laws that were passed back in 1929 that for the first time criminalized crossing the border. The Congress enacted a federal misdemeanor for anyone crossing the border without authorization the first time, and a felony created for anyone crossing the border after they had already been removed once or more times. These days, the misdemeanor carries a maximum sentence of 6 months in jail. The maximum sentence for the felony, the re-entry it's called, is the cap is 2 years. But if you have a criminal record, in addition to being caught recrossing the border, or a number of prior crossing records, they can add sentencing enhancements onto that up to as many as 10 years. So Chertoff really kicked this off by opening little courts, federal courts, magistrate courts across the border that he called Operation Streamline. You may have seen information or heard about this, where they gather upwards of 70 or 80 immigrants in chains, bring them into the courtroom. They all are told what the charges are. They're read their rights, so far as they have any. They plead guilty and they are sentenced in a session that lasts generally no more than about 2 or 3 hours. That's Operation Streamline, where the people who are convicted of misdemeanors are handled. People convicted of, charged with a felony crime go up to the district courts. It takes longer. They get more legal representation, but almost all of them within a month's time or so plead guilty. The average sentence has been declining as the number of people who are convicted of felonies and sent to prison has increased. The average sentence has declined as federal prosecutors appear to be offering better and better deals if people will plead guilty. So last data I've seen from the U.S. Sentencing Commission indicates that right now, people are getting an average of only 9 months behind bars. But those are the people. Some of them are the North Lake facility near Baldwin, Michigan. The number of the data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics on who these people are indicate that 97% of them are men. They're fairly young. The average age is 36 years old. 99% of them are Latinx. So this market gave rise to a second mini boom in terms of the government taking responsibility for contracting out the incarceration of non-citizens. And over the span of years between 2000 and to the present, this gave rise to contracts for 11 car prisons. They're located around the country, most of them in the South and Southwest. But you are the host of, as I mentioned, the North Lake facility, which JR and others are going to talk about. Only about 10% of the 160,000 people in federal prison are in these car prisons. And about 10% of them, 15,000 or 1,500, are located at the North Lake facility. And so I'll stop there and listen with interest to what's going on now, both with efforts to expand detention in Michigan, as well as that dreadful facility at Baldwin.
Thank you so much, Judy and Oscar, for giving us that historical context. I think that's so important in understanding what we're seeing today. I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia and JR, who are going to talk about the private prison in Baldwin, Michigan, and also the detention center that is currently being built in Ionia after it was already struck down by the governor. The federal government is coming once again to try to establish this detention center. And in Baldwin, Michigan, we already had also a couple cases of coronavirus, and I believe also a few deaths. So this really just shows the emphasis of us understanding the historical aspect as well, to understand what is happening today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Cynthia and JR.
Thanks, Janet, and thanks, everybody. Cynthia, would it make sense for me to sort of follow on from Judy and talk mostly about North Lake, sort of touching on the history of no detention centers, and then for you to say a little bit more about the proposal for Ionia? Or do you have a...
No, that sounds fine. I mean, I was sort of thinking that you might say stuff about the history first, and then I would talk about the other, but it works fine to talk about North Lake now.
And can I add something before you guys start? For the ones who are not familiar with the whole picture in Michigan, if you are an immigrant and you get detained by ICE, you have today you have 3 chances. You might end up in Battle Creek, you might end up in Detroit, or you might end up in St. Clair, all the way up north. Those are the 3 choices. Those are county jails where ICE pays rent to keep people in. An immigration detention center is a place where they take someone who was caught being undocumented, and for X, Y, or Z reason, they decide he's going to be deported. Now, there are immigration jails where you go and you do time and then you get deported. and this is what Judy alluded to. Now it's a felony to cross the border for the second time. So they give you in between 6 months and 5 years. So you go, you do time, and after you do time, they deport you. This is a difference in between a detention center and a jail. A big problem is that they are very obscure about posting information, but the best intelligence tells us that a night in a detention center costs $150. $150 for a night in an immigration detention center. In another presentation that I have, I always show a picture of a boutique hotel that my wife and I love in Chicago. And whenever we can, we go to this boutique hotel. We pay $100 for a boutique hotel in the nicest area of Chicago. And it's a really nice place. I'm talking about $150 a night for being in a detention center paid for these companies. So you might end up in one of those county jails as today, and then they want to build this location. And if you have to do time, then they send you to Baldwin. And this is what JR and Cynthia will talk about.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar, for clarifying some of those distinctions among the different kinds of facilities. And there are, it can be confusing, and it can be a lot to keep up with. And there's so much violence that takes place at each of these facilities, right? And they're all part of the same machine, the same system of incarceration and detention and deportation. So No Detention Centers in Michigan it's a statewide coalition of groups and individuals that originally came together in early 2019, so January, February of last year. And that was specifically in opposition to the proposal from ICA, or Immigration Centers of America, to run a new detention center in Ionia for ICE. And No Detention Centers in Michigan, we were organizing from the start. So our first public action was in downtown Grand Rapids, outside the law office of the law firm that was going to be lobbying for ICE in this context. So that was a very, very cold day in January or February 2019, and we had a really good crowd out to let people know that this was not okay, and that the people of Michigan did not want this facility to go forward. And that fight was actually won fairly quickly. That plan for the new detention center was shut down. Governor Whitmer ended up playing a role by refusing the sale of land to ICE and ICA, because she could not get a guarantee that this facility would not house people who had been separated from their families as part of this new policy. Although, of course, part of the context and part of the history that we know and that we try to focus on and really highlight is that all prisons and all detention centers and all jails separate families. So there's a specifically heightened and escalated cruelty of the Trump administration, right, when it comes to immigration policy. But it is part of the infrastructure. It's part of what jails and prisons do to inflict that violence and keep people apart from their loved ones. So that was how No Detention Centers in Michigan came together in early 2019. And there was a short period when we knew that there had been this big victory because the detention center was not going forward in Ionia. And then it wasn't long after that we found out that the GEO group had plans to reopen this prison in Baldwin. And Judy talked somewhat about what kind of facility this is. So this is a CAR facility, or that's short for the racist name, which is Criminal Alien Requirement Facility. They're also often called shadow prisons. And so again, this is, strictly speaking, it's not a detention center. It's a federal prison run by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, contracted out to companies like GEO for non-US citizens who've been convicted of so-called federal crimes. And the majority of those cases, those offenses are either drug-related offenses, so of course this ties exactly into Oscar's presentation from earlier, or immigration-related offenses like unauthorized re-entry, which, as people have talked about, the Trump administration has specifically escalated the prosecution of those offenses as federal crimes. So we have always been really clear about the fact that in so many ways, this prison does overlap with the ICE system, right? And and in so many ways, it is connected to detention centers. And so while it's not a detention center, many of the people there end up, you know, like the path, the sort of convoluted path that takes them to this facility is not that different in some ways from the path that leads to somebody being detained at an ICE facility. So we always make it clear that, you know, that there is that direct connection to detention centers and that many people are there for immigration related offenses, but that at the same time we support people no matter how they ended up there, because we, you know, nobody should be facing these conditions. And so we've been getting a lot of support from this really wonderful national group called Detention Watch Network, and they have a graphic presentation on the North Lake prison that was put together a little while ago, and it's been shared a fair amount online, so I can show that to people. If I can share my screen here. And so this is just on their Instagram page, and I will try to walk through it and not take up too much time, and maybe just say a little bit more about some of these details as they come up. So again, you know, I think for anybody on this call who wants to learn more and wants to keep getting information and updates on some of these systems and problems that we're discussing, I think one great thing to do would be to just follow Detention Watch Network on Facebook or on Instagram, or just check them out, check out their website. It's a national network that's been around for a couple of decades at this point. They do really wonderful work. And I would say, you know, one particular way in which they've been really helpful and really instructive over the last month or so is in thinking about overlaps and intersections between the struggle against the violence of immigrant detention and the system of detention and deportation, and the resurgence that we've been seeing in the last month of the Black-led movement against police violence. And so one example of that, you know, I'm just thinking about in Oscar's presentation from earlier, when he was talking about no-knock warrants, right? And the origins of no-knock warrants in the war on drugs and Nixon's racialized drug policy. You know, people may have that phrase no-knock warrants in their heads because that's the situation that led to the murder of Breonna Taylor in Louisville. And Breonna Taylor actually, her family's from Grand Rapids. So even though she was killed by police in Kentucky, she's originally from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her family, you know, many of her family are here. And some of them, as people may have heard, some of them were actually at an event a couple of days ago in downtown Grand Rapids, where the Grand Rapids Police Department, again, assaulted and arrested people. So that's just to say all of these struggles are deeply connected. So I'll just try to go somewhat quickly through the slides from Detention Watch Network about the prison in Baldwin. So shadow prisons is what these facilities are often called, again, just because there's so little transparency and there's so little accountability with how they're run. So Detention Watch Network says, in addition to ICE detention facilities, the federal government also holds thousands of immigrants in segregated immigrant-only prisons managed by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. These facilities have been referred to as shadow prisons and are entirely operated by private prison companies with an appalling record of abuse. The BOP contracted North Lake Correctional Facility in Baldwin, Michigan, reopened in October 2019 after repeated closures of the facility and in spite of community opposition led by the coalition No Detention Centers in Michigan. So this is a place that has opened and closed and reopened multiple times. It was originally built in the 90s as a youth prison, and that was, you know, that operation was shut down. For a while after that, I think within the last decade, it was housing prisoners from Vermont. So there was a contract to get incarcerated people from out of state who would be held at this facility. And there's actually a really interesting piece that somebody published online. I'm not sure that I have the link offhand right now, but there's probably more than one piece about it. You know, somebody was talking about how chaotically this place was run during that brief period when they were trying to hold prisoners from Vermont. And basically, this is a part of a extremely well-documented and well-known pattern of geo-group facilities just having really dreadful conditions and being extremely, you know, mismanaged and with few services and facilities available for people. So the BOP facility, North Lake, exclusively incarcerates over 1,500 immigrants serving time for federal charges, including unauthorized entry and re-entry a second time across the US border. Until the 1990s, border crossing was almost always treated as a civil offense. Now, however, the increased criminalization and prosecution of border crossings has meant massive profits for private prison companies at the expense of immigrant lives. People detained at North Lake have repeatedly reported extreme negligence, cruelty, and a lack of sanitation. The private company Geo Group operates the prison in secrecy and with near impunity, failing to even provide basic services. So we knew as soon as the COVID-19 crisis started, or as soon as it really began to kick off in March, that this was going to be a crisis that hit North Lake especially hard. And that's exactly what it was. And so there was a long period when we were just barely getting any information at all about what the situation with the virus looked like inside the prison. And we were starting to find out that staff members had tested positive. And there were a couple of journalists who were every day checking in with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services about those numbers of staff members at North Lake who had tested positive and incarcerated people who were starting to test positive too, because there was nowhere else they could get the information. The GEO Group and the Bureau of Prisons were not sending these numbers out publicly. They were required to report them to the Department of Health and Human Services. And so that was the only place that those numbers were available. So we started to hear from people inside. We started to form some connections and relationships with people held at North Lake. And they were telling us about how unseriously the crisis was taken, especially in the early days, how they would beg the guards and the staff members there to wear masks, to wear gloves when they were serving food, to take it seriously. And it was just not being taken seriously. So they were hearing for a while, the people held in Baldwin were hearing about the COVID-19 crisis from us. We were the ones telling them that staff members at the prison had tested positive. They didn't know that. That was not being communicated to them. So they were hearing it from us, or they were hearing it from the news. And we also heard that staff members were telling them not to pay attention to the news. We're telling them that this was all made up. It was not something they had to worry about. As COVID-19 rapidly spreads, people inside the prison are fearful for their lives. And we have multiple recorded calls with people at the prison in North Lake, which I can share. There's a playlist that we've put together on YouTube. And I don't know if we'll have time tonight to listen to those recordings, but I can definitely share the link in the chat if we don't, so that people can hear some of that direct testimony from North Lake. Because people inside the prison for a while have been afraid for their lives. At this point, there are over 100 people who have tested positive for the virus. That includes at least 9 guards. I think in the time since this graphic was put together, that number has at least doubled. Although the information on guards and staff members who tested positive has been harder for us. It's been getting harder for us to find. That they're no longer even releasing those numbers in the same way that they once were. So at least I think 20 guards over the course of this period since March have also tested positive. And 2 people who we know of have died after contracting COVID-19 at North Lake. I personally believe the number to be higher than that. We know that 2 people are confirmed to have died, and there are 2 people who are listed in the Bureau of Prisons online map. And I think that's what the next slide is about. Oh, okay, sorry, maybe the slide after this one talks about the map, and I can say more about that in a second. In protest of the lack of COVID-19 response and abuse by guards, a group of predominantly Black men in prolonged solitary confinement have launched multiple hunger strikes since March, the first cut short after the warden cruelly shut off their water. So this situation is actually how we first were able to get in touch with people at North Lake, because a family member found our Facebook page and reached out to us in early March, so predating slightly the time when COVID-19 was really kicking off. We heard from somebody who was extremely concerned for their loved one's safety, because he was one of a group of about a dozen predominantly Black men who had been isolated in this restricted unit of the prison called the Special Housing Unit, or the SHU. They had been put there after a fight broke out among the incarcerated people at the facility, in which none of them had been involved. So this was a fight involving some other people, very complex situation. And none of the Black incarcerated people at North Lake were involved in that situation. but the guards' response was to immediately basically put all of the Black people incarcerated at North Lake in this restricted unit. And a dozen of them have been there ever since. And they have been on hunger strike 3 times. So that's 3 out of 4 hunger strikes that we know to have taken place at North Lake since March. And so 1 hunger strike was in the general population. That is to say that the larger group of prisoners outside that restricted unit who were demanding COVID-19 testing for everybody and better medical care for everybody inside. And 3 hunger strikes have been launched by this specific group of predominantly Black men in the SHU who've been facing this particularly heightened racial violence and religious discrimination. So I think this slide has a short excerpt from a phone call with one of them.
Right, right. They already violated our right to keep us off of everything. And then they're not giving us our compensation. They're not giving us most of our full time. The warden has been lying to us, telling us all kinds of stories, and then he decided he's not giving us nothing. So we are basically on, we've fallen to nothing, and we haven't done anything. They don't know what they're doing. I mean, this place is unbelievable to humankind. Nothing.
So unbelievable to humankind is the way that person phrases, is how that person describes North Lake. And what we've consistently heard from pretty much everybody we've spoken to on the inside, and Oscar can tell you that number has been growing over the past couple of months. I mean, there are periods when we don't hear from people as often, but at this point, there's a fairly large number of people we've talked to. And what we've heard from many of those people, most of those people, is that this prison is the worst facility they've been in. And some of them have years of experience in the federal prison system. And they were shocked. They were surprised when they arrived in Baldwin to see what this place looked like. So a little bit more about the Bureau of Prisons online map. Detention Watch Network says, since confirming positive cases, the GEO Group and the BOP have avoided full transparency around the number of confirmed cases, waiting weeks before even adding the facility on the Bureau of Prisons map of diagnosed cases. So the Bureau of Prisons does have a so-called COVID-19 resource page, which was put together several months ago as a place for people to get information on how the BOP was handling the crisis. And that included a map that purportedly showed all of the BOP facilities around the country and the number of people at each place who had tested positive for COVID-19. Because North Lake is one of the private facilities that holds non-US citizens, for a long time, it just wasn't showing up on the map at all. And we knew that there were cases there, and that had been confirmed by multiple sources, but it was just literally not on the map. So that, to us, I think, was an excellent example of why these places are called shadow prisons, because family members were reaching out to us who were extremely alarmed and concerned for their loved one's safety, right? And they were going to this place, this website that they were basically told to go to find the information, and there was just nothing there. And even after the information was finally added to that page, the way they're presenting it is still really misleading. You have to click through a couple of really small text sections to get to the list of cases and deaths at private facilities. And when the number of so-called active cases had gone down to 0, that is to say, when, according to the GEO Group and according to the BOP, all the people who had tested positive for COVID-19 had recovered at North Lake, it was taken off the map again. So even though there had been 50, 60, 70 cases there, if you were just looking at the map, you would maybe have the impression that there had never been an issue with COVID-19 there. And so at this point, the number of people who overall have tested positive, who are confirmed to have tested positive, is over 100. But again, I personally believe the number to be much, much higher, because we've known from the beginning that they haven't been testing everybody, and that the systems they have in place for not only testing people, but treating people when they test positive are just extremely inadequate. So back in May, 50 loved ones of people incarcerated at North Lake, along with No Detention Centers in Michigan, and at this point, over 40 organizations, sent a letter to the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Justice demanding increased transparency and expanded plans to release people throughout the federal prison system. So recognizing that the director of the Bureau of Prisons and William Barr, in the early days of the crisis, had spoken about how there was some kind of awareness of the specific danger that COVID-19 posed to incarcerated populations. So, you know, you can find William Barr saying something like, "We don't want these places to become petri dishes where the infection spreads." And of course, that's exactly what's happened. And so there was vague talk about a plan to release people from the Bureau of Prisons on a large scale nationally, which just never happened. So the family members and loved ones of people held at North Lake who signed that letter with us, that was one of the demands of that letter. And even though the letter was sent back in May, you know, we are still accepting signatures on it, so I can share the link for that letter in the chat as well. So to close this part of the presentation, as Detention Watch Network says, every day that people remain incarcerated at North Lake poses a threat to their lives and to our collective well-being. And so they encourage people to take action by following No Detention Centers. And we are, you know, again, just very grateful for the support that we've gotten from Detention Watch Network. And we will continue to organize and fight against this appalling facility in Baldwin and find out more. And you know, I'm so glad to have a chance to talk to so many people about it today. And I think we would love to hear, you know, ideas that you all have, and you know, any questions about North Lake. I think we'd be glad to answer. So that's where I will leave off for now.
So I actually, okay, good, that got solved. So I am going to talk just a little bit about, I recognize we're over our time already, and thank you for staying, but just talk a little bit about sort of more the nuts and bolts of what we do. And I am going to read my presentation because of time. So after the situation, after we found out about the situation in Baldwin, we did try to stop it, and I wasn't actually going to talk too much about this, but our original strategy was, because we had heard that they were, you know, teetering on the brink of economic instability, was to try and get more people to not invest in them. And we targeted Prudential. Actually, that first photo in the presentation that JR just made was from a very large Prudential protest that we had, can't remember, Southfield or Southgate or something. And we also protested on the day that, you know, at the point that we discovered that they weren't going to actually, we weren't going to be able to prevent it, that they were opening October 1st of last year. We went up and held a protest. As an organization, we are a coalition, and it's a very informal organization. We intend to have a non-hierarchical structure, so there are no officers, and we're all volunteers. We're mostly prison abolitionists, by which I mean we believe that there shouldn't be prisons at all, but we're not all prison abolitionists. And we have different views about the time frame and the methods of reaching abolition. And there are a lot of people involved in No Detention Centers who are not, you know, who might not attend a meeting, who might never attend a meeting. One example is that one of our members, who is sometimes very active, but active off and on, gave a presentation about No Detention Centers to the group of protesters that's been gathering in Detroit. And she said that it was very well received. And so there are little demonstrations of support and awareness raising like that go on a lot. We do a lot of partnering, and our two biggest partners have been mentioned, Detention Watch Network and also Action of Greater Lansing, which serves as our fiduciary. We stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and to see that our statement on that, I would read it if I had time, but to see that, I'm going to put in the chat our Facebook page, which is you have to scroll down a little bit, but you can find our solidarity statement. We also do some advocacy and legislative and policy advocacy work. Right now we're part of a really good project to develop a state legislation, working with a state senator in Michigan. The overall concern is police abolition, again, partnering with groups that are concerned about police abolition. But one of the asks, as I said, we're just in the middle of the project. One of the asks may be to prevent private prisons in the state of Michigan, which is a very complicated call because, it being the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the state doesn't have much control over that. But also, Oscar and another active member who is on this call, Mary Minor, had contacted the congressional representative, the national representative, Alyssa Slotkin, and that resulted in us being asked to submit questions for a hearing that took place yesterday, and I think something that's going to take place tomorrow as well. The one on Tuesday was specifically about Geo Group and Core Civic. And in addition to North Lake, which has been a huge concern for us, and as I said, we were, when the pandemic hit, we were planning on having a large convergence there in Baldwin area in May, and that got canceled. But we certainly, hope to spring back into action. But in addition, we found out not too long ago, and I meant to look up the exact date, but in late April or so, that ICE has renewed its interest in the Ionia area. They need to have a detention center within 200 miles of their office in Detroit, and Ionia just barely fits the bill. And so they initially reached out to the Ionia County Board of Commissioners, letting them know that they were starting an environmental assessment on a property that's just outside the city of Ionia in a place called Ionia Township. And they also expressed interest in having the board issue a resolution of approval for that project, even though there was no official need for them to do so. So we and some of the people who originally opposed it the first time, along with the Ionia County Democrats, came together to pressure the Ionia County Commissioners to instead pass a resolution of disapproval. We started a private Facebook page. We took out a small ad in a local paper, and then the virtual meeting, people swamped it. There were over, something like, there were definitely dozens of negative comments, and the
negative about the detention center, just to clarify, like comments against the detention center.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. Comments in opposition to the detention center. And so then the board postponed the decision. When we went to organize to do the same thing at the following meeting, we saw it wasn't on the agenda, and it turns out that the board had decided not to decide. And they specifically said that it was the result of all the opposition that they'd heard. So the private detention center there would be run by Immigration Centers of America, ICA, which is a very small company similar to Geo Group and Core Civic. And they run the notorious Farmville prison in Virginia. And so we organized a press conference, which ultimately turned out to be thanking the board for not making a decision. We ended up having local residents, both JR and Oscar, a medical professional, an ACLU representative, and in particular, a member of one of the groups who opposes Farmville, Collectiva in Virginia. And she pointed out that, you know, there's a long history of abuse, and that, you know, like the jobs that are going to be produced are not necessarily going to be good jobs. They mistreat their people. And I am going to put a link in the chat for an article that came out yesterday concerning their abysmal handling in Farmville, this is in Virginia, of the COVID outbreak. You know, their mistreatment of everyone, it's just horrific. And they, you know, it shouldn't happen anywhere. So after that, you know, that we considered a victory with the county commission, we're really struggling with how to proceed because the place that it's located has no zoning, so we can't go that route of asking the township to help us prevent it. Nobody really seems to have jurisdiction over it. It's a private property. And we tried to contact the landowners and see if they were willing to sell to someone else, or if they had any like moral hesitation, but they were not open to talking, so we're assuming not. It seems like that approach is not going to work. So recently we spoke with a couple of national site fight experts on a call that Detention Watch Network arranged. And they had several suggestions, including one avenue that we pursued a little bit, which I think is also going to be a dead end, about an access road in another township that does have zoning. But we are going to follow up on those suggested strategies. We're going to follow up on every one of them. And we are looking for help. And so I guess to end this, I'm going to go through a few of the ways that people can get involved directly, and some of the things that we would love for them to help us do. The first thing is to attend meetings. There's currently still virtual, although we are talking about organizing a big outdoor meeting in the Ionia area. Our meetings are held most Saturdays at 2 p.m. and you can contact Janet. Will have the information, or I'm going to put my email in the chat to get directions for joining those meetings. And another, hold on just a second. Another task, I'll first talk about general tasks. We need help with FOIA requests. We need help researching articles that are related, researching ICE detention center policies, Federal Bureau of Prison policies, the private prison policies that the Federal Bureau of Prisons has, and also possibly researching our relationship to prison abolition and getting more information about that, and searching for articles, helping with press releases, and helping just in general to get the word out. You know, sharing on social media, letting people know about the Farmville connection, and assisting with our website, which is www.nodetentioncentersmi.org. And in just a minute, I can put that in the chat too. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble finding the chat here.
Oh, I think I actually put the website in the chat, a few lines up.
Okay, cool.
Sorry, I put a couple of things there at once.
And I think that Janet is gonna have a flyer with that information, so don't worry about it.
Right, and also I think that I'm going to share this with Janet too. So, so specifically with North Lake, we're looking for people to help with outreach to churches in the area, and when it becomes more possible, on-site assessment of the conditions in that area, specifically how the prison is perceived, and then specifically with Ionia. We're intending to do a yard sign campaign. So we're going to hopefully distribute yard signs at the large meeting proposed. The people that gave us advice suggested having teach-ins. They called this visualizing the opposition. So in other words, even though it's not like hot, making sure that we're out there and that people know that we're out there. Another task is researching what union covers Ionia's regular prison. They have a very well-known prison in Ionia, state prison, and you know what the unions are like in that prison. Researching advertising and prices of billboards, prices of other advertising, and as Oscar said, that will be that will be disseminated in a document that Janet is going to send out, and I don't have anything further.
Thank you so much, Cynthia and JR. I mean, yeah, everything that you all just mentioned is just mind-blowing, and I really hope it was informative and something that everybody hopefully learned something today. Cynthia, you just mentioned like at least 10 different ways that we can get involved as students, and right now we're living through, you know, the coronavirus era, where everything is basically virtual. You can get involved by attending these meetings virtually, helping virtually with the website, with research, with articles, all of that matter. And I really encourage everybody to really use this education that you just learned to get involved and support. I think there's this quote that says, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And I really hope that everybody was paying attention and is outraged and hopefully willing to get involved with the work that everybody is doing. Thank you, Cynthia, JR, Judy, and Oscar for your presentations and giving the historical overview as well, which is also so incredibly important to learn, to see the legacies that are carrying on and that we see today still persisting. With that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and email everybody a list of how to get involved, everything that Cynthia just mentioned on how you can get involved. I will send an email with everybody who RSVP'd and kind of send out a flyer, a little bit of a visual so that you guys can all get involved.
Let me just say, we did. I'm assuming we're probably not going to do the Q&A because it's so late. We are available to answer questions, and Janet can help facilitate that. You know, we'll be happy to answer your questions, and you know, I feel badly that, you know, I mean, it's such a complex subject, so it took a long time.
Yeah. And I also wanted to mention 1 minute, no more than 1 minute. Action for Lansing does a lot of other things related to immigration, to civil rights for immigrants, and we spend a lot of energy doing work with No Detention Centers. But Mary Miner is here, is a member of Action for Lansing. Paul Brown is here, he's also a member of Action for Lansing. We are providing legal services for immigrants. We help immigrants to go to court. We drive them to their meetings with ICE in Detroit. We are lobbying for at the state level to be able to get people in elected positions who are immigrant friendly. And there's a long laundry list of things that you can do if you feel that the things that No Detention Center does maybe you can find something that fits your skills and your interests working with those in Action of Lansing, and in a way, helping Action of Lansing, you will be helping No Detention Centers in Michigan. It's so clear to me that all those things interlace to each other, and you helping one way, you're helping in another way. As I said, we provide legal services, we provide companionship for immigrants, and now with COVID, we are helping them to get medical care and those things. Thank you. And if you have questions or you want to know about it, let me know, and I'll be happy to give you more information.
Yes, thank you. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email us. I just want to emphasize again to the people who live in Michigan that this is happening. You know, sometimes we watch this stuff on the news and we see how coronavirus is affecting, disproportionately affecting Black, Brown, and immigrant lives. And we see it on the news, but we don't realize that it's happening right in our states. You know, Baldwin, Michigan is literally probably like 2 hours away from Lansing. What they're trying to create in Ionia is probably 1 hour from East Lansing. And I really just want to emphasize that this stuff is happening right in like our backyards. And I think it's very incredibly important that everybody gets informed and involved, and keep going to meetings like this to inform yourselves and also share all the knowledge that you learned and amplify the voices of the people who are doing this work, like they are, like Cynthia, like Oscar and Judy, because they have given up so much of their time and energy really working on this stuff. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It's been really, really good talking with people.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye.